Well, Keith, if I have a good year and can help this ball club, I'd like to play another year. If I don't play or hit as well this year, that'll probably be it.
Who do you think will win the National League batting title this year? Hank Aaron or Pinson or who?
Well, I guess those two, along with Tim Boyer of our club, those three should be battling it most of the way.
Stan Musial was one of baseball's most loved heroes, but the tragic truth about his death is not what most fans have been told. Stan Musial died on January 19, 2013. He was 92 years old. He passed away at his home, surrounded by his family. For years, videos and articles have called his death a tragic mystery, hinting at secrets and cover-ups. That story sounds exciting. It is also wrong. The real truth is quieter, and in its own way, sadder. It is a story about how the internet can take a peaceful ending and turn it into something it never was. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. If you think stories like this deserve to be remembered correctly, use the hype feature and give this video some hype. It helps more fans see the real story behind the legend. For most of his life, Stan Musial was known simply as Stan the Man. He played 22 years for the St. Louis Cardinals. He never asked for special treatment. He never caused a scandal. Reporters who covered him closely for decades struggled hard to find even a single bad thing to say about him. That made him unusual in professional sports. Fans loved him because he seemed steady and kind, year after year. When he finally passed away at 92, the sporting world expected a simple, respectful goodbye. Instead, something strange happened online. Search results and video titles began linking his name to words like tragic, secret, and lied about. None of that came from his actual life. It came from somewhere else entirely, and that is where this story gets interesting. Think about how unusual that really is. Most stories that promise a hidden scandal behind a beloved figure eventually point to something real, even if it gets exaggerated along the way. A star athlete who broke rules, a celebrity who hid an addiction, a public figure who mistreated the people around them. With Stan Musial, none of that exists. Reporters spent decades looking for cracks in his reputation and mostly came up empty. That absence of any real scandal is exactly what makes his case so unusual. The tragic death story attached to his name did not grow out of something true that got stretched into something bigger. It grew out of nothing at all, built entirely from other people's tragedies that happened to share his name, or his hometown, or his era. Stan Musial lived to see his 92nd birthday. That alone tells you his story was not a short or sudden one. He had already lived through the entire Great Depression as a young boy. He served proudly in the United States Navy during World War II. He built one of the greatest careers in baseball history. Then he spent 5 decades after retirement as a beloved figure in St. Louis, appearing at Cardinals games and community events. In May of 2012, his wife Lillian passed away. The two of them had been married for 72 years. They had been together since they were teenagers in high school. Losing her after that many decades together was a real and heavy loss for him. 8 months later, Stan Musial died too. Many fans only saw 2 headlines, one about his wife and one about him, without understanding the quiet grief that filled the months in between. That is a real sadness. It did not need to be exaggerated into something it was not. 72 years is a long time to spend beside one person. It is longer than most people even live. Think about everything that changes across 7 decades. Entire careers beginning and ending, children growing up and having children of their own, a whole world shifting again and again, and through all of it, Stan and Lillian Musial stayed together. When she passed away, he lost the one person who had been present for every single part of his life, long before he was famous and long after the cheering stopped. A short news headline cannot hold that kind of loss. It can only report a date and a name. The real weight of losing a spouse after 72 years together does not fit into a single sentence, and it should not need a made-up scandal to feel important. It already was, quietly and completely, in a way that no headline could ever fully capture. So where did the idea of a tragic, hidden death come from? This is the part most fans never hear. Search engines and video algorithms are built to connect names, places, and events. Sometimes that connecting goes wrong. Stan Musial's name has been mixed up, again and again, with completely different tragedies that have nothing to do with his own life or death. Once you see how this happened, the whole tragic death story falls apart. The first mix-up involves a Cardinals outfielder named Oscar Taveras. In October of 2014, Nearly 2 years after Stan Musial had passed away, Tavares was killed in a car accident. He was only 22 years old. Grieving fans gathered at the Stan Musial statue outside Busch Stadium to mourn him, because that statue is where Cardinals fans have always gone to grieve as a community. News articles about Tavares naturally mentioned the Musial statue. Later, automated systems scanning those articles saw the words "tragic death" sitting next to the name Musial, and wrongly connected the two men. Oscar Tavares died young and suddenly. Stan Musial did not. They are two separate stories that got tangled together by machines that cannot tell the difference. It helps to picture exactly how that particular kind of mistake happens in practice. A computer program scanning through thousands of articles is not reading for meaning the way a human reader does. It is often just looking for words that appear near each other, over and over, across many different pages. If enough articles about Tavares mention both his own tragic accident and the Musial statue where fans gathered afterward, the program can start to treat those two ideas as connected, even though a human reader would immediately understand they describe two completely different men and two completely different events. This is exactly the kind of error that can quietly build into a widespread false idea online, without anyone ever intending to spread misinformation in the first place. A similar mix-up happened with a Cardinals pitcher named Darryl Kile. In June of 2002, Kile died suddenly from a heart problem while the team was on the road. His death came only days after the passing of a beloved Cardinals broadcaster. It was a genuinely tragic period for the team, and old footage from that time sometimes shows a mourning Stan Musial, since he was a senior figure the whole organization looked up to. But footage of Musial mourning someone else is not evidence of anything happening to Musial himself. Search systems that cannot understand context have still managed to blur these events together over the years. This is a pattern worth noticing, because it repeats throughout Musial's digital history. He was such a constant, respected presence at the Cardinals organization for so many decades that he appears in photographs and footage connected to almost every major event in the team's history, both happy and sad. That constant presence made him a kind of living symbol for the whole franchise. It also meant that his face and his name became attached in archives and databases to tragedies that had nothing to do with his own life, simply because he happened to be standing nearby, offering comfort to others, the same way any respected elder statesman of a team would. There is an even older case involving a player named Charlie Pete. In 1956, Pete died in a plane crash along with his wife and children. It was one of the most heartbreaking losses in the team's history, because Pete and Musial played for the Cardinals in the same era. Articles listing tragic deaths of Cardinals players often place their names side by side. Reading quickly, it is easy to see two names near the word tragic and assume both stories belong to both men. They do not. Pete's death was his own tragedy, decades before Musial's peaceful passing at 92. Then there is the strange case of the bridge. There is a real bridge named after Stan Musial, built to honor his service and his legacy. In March of 2012, a construction worker named Andy Gammon drowned when equipment fell into the river during the bridge's construction. His family later filed a lawsuit over his death. News reports about that lawsuit used phrases like Stan Musial Bridge, tragic death, and settlement, all in the same sentence, because those were simply the facts of the case. Automated news systems, however, are not good at understanding that a bridge named after a person is not the same as that person. Some online systems ended up suggesting that these legal proceedings were somehow tied to Musial's own passing, when they were actually about a construction accident that happened to a different man entirely. This particular mix-up shows just how far this kind of confusion can travel. A bridge is simply a structure named to honor someone. It is not the person themselves, and legal cases about accidents during its construction have nothing to do with the man whose name it carries. Yet because search systems often match on keywords rather than actual meaning, a lawsuit involving a construction company, a barge, and a river accident ended up loosely connected online to a baseball legend who had nothing to do with any of it, simply because his name appeared on a sign near where the accident happened. On top of all that, there is one more strange source of confusion, and it comes from medicine, not sports. Researchers who study memory loss in older adults sometimes use a method called a famous name test. In this kind of research, doctors show elderly patients a list of famous names from many decades ago, to see which names the patients can still recognize. Because Stan Musial was one of the most famous athletes of the 1950s, His name has appeared on these standardized lists many times, right alongside names used to measure memory decline in patients who are not musial at all. When automated systems later scanned these medical papers, they saw the words Stan Musial sitting next to terms like memory loss, and wrongly assumed it meant Musial himself had suffered from a memory condition. He did not. His actual medical history does not support that claim. It was simply his famous name being used as a measuring stick in research about other people entirely. This kind of mistake is easy to understand once it is explained clearly, but it can be very convincing before that explanation happens. A person searching online for information about Stan Musial and memory loss might come across a real, legitimate scientific paper that includes both his name and serious medical terms about memory and aging. Without reading the paper closely, it would be easy to assume that paper is describing Musial's own health, especially if a video title had already suggested exactly that. In reality, the scientists writing that paper never examined Musial personally and never claimed he had any memory condition at all. They simply needed a name that patients from his generation would likely recognize, and his fame made him a convenient choice for that purpose, nothing more. Put all of these pieces together, and you can see exactly how a peaceful death at 92 turned into a viral story about tragedy and secrets. None of it came from Musial's real life. It came from a mixed-up outfielder, a mixed-up pitcher, a mixed-up plane crash from the 1950s, a mixed-up bridge accident, and a mixed-up medical study. 4 completely different tragedies, none of them his own, all folded together by machines that were never built to tell true stories apart from false ones. There is one more tragedy in this story, and it is real, but it did not happen to Stan Musial. It happened to his father. Musial grew up in Donora, Pennsylvania, a small town built around a zinc works and a steel plant. In late October of 1948, a heavy fog settled over the town and trapped the smoke and chemicals from those factories close to the ground for days. Dozens of residents became sick, and many of them died. Among the people who suffered lasting damage to their lungs from that smog was Musial's own father, Lukasz, who eventually died from its effects. This was a genuine and painful loss for Musial, one that stayed with him for the rest of his life. It is also the real reason he refused to appear in cigarette advertisements throughout his career, even though those ads paid very well and most stars of his era gladly took the money. He had watched what breathing in poisoned air did to his father, and he wanted no part in encouraging anyone else to fill their lungs with smoke. This is a true tragedy connected to Musial's family, and it deserves to be remembered honestly. What should not happen is confusing his father's death in 1948 with Musial's own death 65 years later. Automated systems scanning old articles about the Donora smog have sometimes done exactly that, blending a father's tragedy into the son's biography as if it were the same event. This distinction matters more than it might first seem. A father's death from an environmental disaster in 1948 and a son's peaceful passing at 92 in 2013 are 2 entirely different events, separated by 65 years and by completely different causes. One was a genuine tragedy, tied to industrial pollution and a failure to protect a small town's residents. The other was the natural ending of a long, celebrated life. Treating them as the same story, or even hinting that they are connected beyond the fact that they happen to the same family, does a disservice to both men and to the very real history of what actually happened in Donora all those years ago. There is also an older myth about Musial's youth that has nothing to do with his death, but everything to do with the phrase, "what they lied about." For decades, biographies told a dramatic story about Musial's path into professional baseball. According to that story, his father wanted him to accept a basketball scholarship at a major university instead of playing minor league baseball, and only a tearful moment from his mother convinced his father to let him choose baseball instead. It is a moving scene, the kind that fits neatly into a movie. It is also not what actually happened. Research into Musial's early life shows that he had already signed a professional baseball contract with the Cardinals organization in the spring of 1937, months before this supposed scholarship conflict was said to occur. Once a young athlete signed a professional contract in that era, strict amateur sports rules meant he could never again play college sports in any sport, including basketball. In other words, the dramatic scholarship story could not have happened the way it was told, because Musial was no longer eligible for college sports by the time it supposedly took place. There was real tension in his family about his choice of career, since his mother felt his signing bonus should have been larger. But the emotional kitchen conversation, the crying mother, and the stubborn father giving in at the last moment, all of that appears to have been added later to make his origin story feel more dramatic than it actually was. This is a genuine example of a lie in Musial's story, though it is a small, old-fashioned kind of Hollywood embellishment rather than a dark secret. Knowing all of this, it becomes easier to understand what actually happened in Musial's final years, and why some fans still felt surprised and sad when he passed. As he grew older, Musial naturally slowed down. He appeared at fewer public events than he once had. This is completely normal for a man in his 80s and 90s. Walking onto a field, traveling to ceremonies, and standing for long appearances becomes harder for anyone at that age. His family and friends did not treat this slowdown as some dark secret to hide. It was simply what happens to people as they age. But because Musial had spent decades as a constant, visible presence at Cardinals games and Hall of Fame ceremonies, his gradual absence still felt noticeable to fans who had grown used to seeing him everywhere. A man who once seemed to attend every ceremony, every reunion, and every opening day suddenly appearing less and less was bound to draw attention, even without any scandal attached to it. This is where a real, human tension shows up in the story, even without any invented scandal. Fans had spent a lifetime picturing Musial as an almost permanent figure, always smiling, always present, always the same friendly hero from their childhood memories. Nobody stays the same forever. Growing older, appearing less often in public, and eventually losing his wife of 72 years, were all real parts of Musial's final chapter. None of it was hidden out of shame. It was simply private, in the way that getting older and grieving a spouse are naturally private things for any family, famous or not. A person can understand, intellectually, that everyone ages and eventually passes away, while still feeling genuinely surprised when it finally happens to someone who felt like a permanent part of their own childhood. Musial's own personality made this privacy even more likely. Throughout his life, he was famously humble. He never chased extra attention, even when he easily could have. After retiring from baseball, he spent much of his time on charity work, on Cardinals-related appearances, and simply being with his family. He was not the kind of man who called reporters to update the public on his daily health or his private struggles. That humility was one of the most admired parts of his character while he was alive. In his final years, that same humility meant fewer public statements, fewer updates, and more quiet time spent simply living, rather than performing his fame for cameras. Fans who loved the public version of Stan Musial did not always get to see this quieter, more private final chapter, not because anyone was lying to them, but because that final chapter was simply lived mostly out of view, the same way it had always been for a man who never needed the spotlight to feel complete. There is something almost old-fashioned about that kind of privacy today. In an era when public figures often share every detail of their lives, Musial's quiet approach to aging can feel unusual, even mysterious to modern audiences who are used to constant updates. Willie Mays, who played against Musial in All-Star games for years, often said that Musial looked out for him and treated him with genuine respect during a time when many white players did not. Bob Gibson, a Cardinals pitcher known for having little patience for unfairness of any kind, spoke about Musial as the kindest man he ever met in the sport, and said it almost surprised him to find that kind of decency in a game that could otherwise feel harsh and unwelcoming. These were not casual compliments. They came from teammates and rivals who had every reason to speak honestly, and who lived through the very era when segregation and prejudice were common in professional baseball. In 1962, Musial chose to leave the segregated hotel where the team was staying during spring training in Florida, so that he could stay instead with his black teammates at an integrated hotel. That is not the action of a man secretly enforcing segregation. It is the action of a quiet man choosing decency over comfort, even without making a public statement about it. Musial's fairness showed up off the field just as much as it did on the field itself, and his business history helps explain why claims of hidden financial secrets around him do not hold up either. In the spring of 1943, he briefly held out from signing his contract, asking the Cardinals for a raise up to $10,000 for the season. The team's owner initially offered far less, and even threatened to send him home. Musial ended up compromising at $7,500 and reported to training camp, a practical resolution rather than a bitter fight. Even more unusual, in 1960, after a season where his batting average had dropped noticeably, Musial voluntarily asked the Cardinals to reduce his own salary from $100,000 down to $80,000, arguing that his pay should match his performance on the field. Few athletes in any era have ever asked to be paid less. Decades later, in the late 1970s, a real estate business connected to Musial's name became involved in a lawsuit over a commission on a hotel sale. A federal appeals court reviewed the case closely and ruled entirely in Musial's favor, confirming that his side of the business had been upfront from the start about not paying that commission. Taken together, these are not the actions of a man with hidden financial secrets. They are the actions of someone who dealt with money the same honest way he dealt with everything else in his public life. Stories that promise hidden financial secrets behind a famous name usually rely on the audience never actually checking the court records or the contract history. In Musial's case, those records exist, and they point in the opposite direction of any scandal. A man who asks to be paid less because his performance dipped is not someone hiding financial wrongdoing. A business that wins its case in federal court by showing it had been transparent from the very beginning is not covering anything up. The paper trail behind Stan Musial's business life is remarkably clean, which is exactly why nobody promoting the tragic death story ever points to it. There is nothing there to build a scandal around. It is worth pausing here to ask a harder question. Did the public's love for the perfect, unshakable version of Stan Musial make it harder for people to picture him as an ordinary man, aging and grieving like anyone else? For decades, fans knew him through his statistics, his smile, and his highlight reels. Those things do not age. A career total stays exactly the same forever. A photograph from 1948 never gets older. But the real man behind those numbers did get older, year after year, just like everyone else. When his public appearances slowed and then eventually stopped, some fans were left holding on to a frozen image of him from decades earlier without realizing how much time had actually passed. That gap between the frozen legend and the real, aging man is not a scandal. It is simply what happens when a public figure lives a very long life. None of this should take away from what Stan Musial actually accomplished, because his real career needs no exaggeration to be remarkable. Over 22 seasons, he collected 3,630 hits, one of the highest totals in the history of the sport. He won 3 Most Valuable Player awards. He was selected to 24 All-Star games. Baseball historians still study his career as one of the most consistent ever recorded, because he performed at an elite level no matter where a game was played or how much pressure surrounded it. In fact, of those 3,630 hits, exactly half came in home games, and exactly half came in road games, a perfect balance that is almost never seen in professional sports. He also rarely struck out for a power hitter of his kind, missing on only about 6% of his plate appearances across his whole career, which helped make him the only player in baseball history to finish with more than 400 home runs, more than 1,900 runs scored, and more than 1,900 runs batted in, while striking out fewer than 1,000 times total. Part of what made him so consistent was his unusual batting stance, a deep, crouched, twisting position where he peeked at the pitcher over his shoulder before swinging. Some hitting coaches of his era considered it strange or even incorrect. Musial kept it anyway because it worked for his body and his eyesight, and it let him track a pitch early and adjust his swing in the final moment before contact. Fans gathered at his statue outside Busch Stadium to pay their respects, the same statue that would later, tragically and separately, become a gathering place for Oscar Taveras as well. In the days after his death, baseball did what it always does when it loses one of its great figures, pausing to remember, to celebrate, and to honor a life that had genuinely earned that kind of respect. But even in that outpouring of love, there is a quieter question worth asking. Were people mourning the whole man, including his quiet final years of aging and grief? Or were they mostly celebrating the shining highlight reel version of him, frozen at the peak of his career? It is a fair question, and it does not have one simple answer. Most public tributes naturally focus on a person's greatest achievements, rather than their final, quieter years. That is normal and human. It does not mean anyone acted wrongly. It simply means that the full, true picture of any long life, including its slow final chapters, rarely fits neatly into a highlight reel or a news headline. This is not unique to Stan Musial. It happens whenever a beloved public figure lives long enough for the public to see two very different versions of the same person. The strong, famous version from their prime years, and the older, quieter version from their final ones. There is also the older myth about his youth, the dramatic scholarship story that never actually happened the way it was told, and the false accusation of personal racism that falls apart the moment Curt Flood's own words are read in full. None of these separate threads involve any real wrongdoing by Musial himself. Instead, each one shows a different way that a genuinely admirable life can get reshaped, exaggerated, or misunderstood once it passes through retelling after retelling, article after article, and algorithm after algorithm. A basketball scholarship conflict that never truly happened, a restaurant incident that Musial personally corrected, a medical research method that borrowed his famous name, a bridge, a plane crash from decades earlier, a young teammate's separate accident. None of it adds up to a lie Musial told. It adds up to a story that other people and other systems told about him without always checking whether it was true. The word tragic gets used constantly online because it grabs attention. In Stan Musial's case, the true story does not need that word to matter. A 92-year-old man, deeply loved by millions, quietly living out his final years after losing the woman he had spent 72 years beside, is not a tragedy in the dramatic sense that headlines suggest. It is simply the natural, sometimes sad, ending of an extraordinary life. The internet did not uncover some hidden secret about Stan Musial. It accidentally invented one, by stitching together pieces of stories that were never his to begin with. None of this erases what Stan Musial meant to the game of baseball, or to the city of St. Louis, or to the millions of fans who grew up watching him play. He remains remembered as one of the kindest, most consistent, and most respected figures the sport has ever produced. His 3,630 hits still stand as one of the great achievements in baseball history. His 3 Most Valuable Player awards and 24 All-Star selections still mark him as one of the finest players to ever step onto a field. His humility, his sportsmanship, and his 72-year marriage to Lillian remain part of a genuinely remarkable American life, one that did not need any invented mystery to feel meaningful. A life like that speaks for itself, plainly and honestly, without any need for a dramatic title to make people care. After his passing, his family made the decision to sell part of his personal collection of memorabilia through a public auction, while keeping many deeply personal items for themselves. The sale included his 2011 World Series ring from the Cardinals championship, a handwritten letter he had received from Ty Cobb decades earlier, a baseball signed by Babe Ruth from when Musial was still a young minor league player, and his own preserved copy of his rookie card from 1948. Together, these items sold for more than $1 million, a clear sign of how much his legacy still meant to fans years after his career ended. A short time later, the memorabilia company that had spent nearly 25 years selling his signed items closed its doors, simply because it had run out of inventory to sell. There was no dispute, no scandal, and no hidden conflict in how his estate was handled. It was a quiet, orderly conclusion to a business built entirely on genuine admiration for one man's life and career. Some commentators questioned whether the family should have sold any of his memorabilia at all, wondering out loud if it somehow diminished his legacy to see his personal items go up for public auction. But selling part of a collection while keeping the most personal pieces private is a completely ordinary decision for any family managing an estate, famous or not. It allowed fans and collectors who admired him to own a genuine piece of his story, while his family kept what mattered most to them personally. That is not a scandal either. It is simply what a well-organized, honestly managed estate looks like after a long and celebrated life comes to an end. The real story of Stan Musial is not about lies, cover-ups, or hidden tragedy. It is about a great baseball player who grew old, like all of us eventually do, and who was deeply missed when he finally passed away peacefully at 92, surrounded by the people who loved him most. That is not a scandal. It is simply a full, honest, human life remembered exactly as it deserves to be, without the noise the internet later added to it. The next time a video or an article promises to reveal the tragic truth behind a beloved figure, it is worth remembering Stan Musial's story. Sometimes the most dramatic-sounding claims fall apart the moment someone takes the time to check them carefully. Sometimes a mixed-up outfielder, a mixed-up pitcher, a mixed-up medical study, and a bridge named in someone's honor are all it takes to build an entire false legend out of nothing. The truth about Stan Musial was never hidden in some dark secret. It was always right there in plain sight. In 72 years of marriage, in 3,630 honest hits, in a father's real tragedy that had nothing to do with his son's peaceful ending, and in a quiet, humble man who simply grew old and was loved every step of the way. That story does not need an exaggerated title to matter. It only needed someone willing to tell it correctly, checking every claim against what actually happened, rather than what sounded most exciting, and choosing honesty over easy attention. The same quiet honesty Stan Musial carried with him for all 92 years of his remarkable life.